wasn't expecting that. Thank you very much. My books, 1994 and 1997, Surviving the Millennium and Dangerous Crossroads, both outlined the crisis that we're facing today, and in my view, that could have been prevented had the Clinton administration had a little more forethought. But it wasn't based on prophecy. Everything that I based it on was the Russian threats that took place in the period 1991 to 1994 before the Budapest Memorandum, which was just mentioned, was signed. Everything, threats to the Crimea, threats to taking southeast Ukraine, annihilating much of Ukraine, all that was made behind the scenes or in public forum by nationalists, Russian nationalists at the time. And Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, Mikhail Gorbachev both warned the Americans against enlarging NATO. It was quite clear that it was going to cause a backlash. And if going back to '94, when I read the Clinton administration national security doctrine, this is all on the George Washington University website, you can see the shallowness of the thinking of how they went about in decision to enlarge NATO. It was based on two, at least in Anthony Lake, the National Security Advisor's mind, it was based on two, in my view, misinterpretations of the Russian reaction to NATO enlargement and to the INF Treaty, and I'll get to that in just a second. But in terms of German unification in NATO, unified Germany, the Russians didn't really scream, shout. They took it, seemed to have taken it with greater ease. And so Anthony Lake argued, oh, well, you know, they might kick and scream a little bit, but they'll eventually accept NATO enlargement throughout all of Eastern Europe. But the other argument, which he didn't really reflect upon, was the argument that when we had the INF crisis from 1997 to 1987, the INF treaty, he made it sound like in his memos that this was nothing, that the Russians really didn't react to this. They willingly accepted the fact that they'd give up their SS-20s in exchange for the U.S. threats to deploy Pershing and cruise missiles. But anybody who remembers that time knows very well that we came very close to nuclear war in 1983 in the Able Archer NATO maneuvers in '83, when the Russians believed that NATO was preparing for a real war, not just the maneuvers, and suddenly their computer screens were seeing missiles flying into Soviet airspace. Fortunately, they realized that was a computer error and not a reality. But it illustrated the kind of paranoia that Moscow felt as NATO was deploying these cruise and Pershing missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles and Pershing missiles. And we got through that period, but it took from 1983 to 1987, 1988 for the treaty to finally be signed. So it wasn't an easy period, and we remember the period in the early 80s of Ronald Reagan threatening Moscow and the threats that came back from Moscow at that time until Gorbachev came to power. So my point is that period, we're coming back to that period right now. Right now, the U.S. is planning to deploy Tomahawk cruise missiles in Germany by 2026. President Trump just threatened to give Ukraine Tomahawk cruise missiles. He backed off of it, which I think was a wise decision. We're also deploying them differently. We're also deploying them in the Philippines and Guam. So we're walking into a new global missile crisis similar to the period from 1987 to 1977 to 1987. But in a very different circumstances in which China has become a major nuclear threat in the American view. Now, that period, as I said, was used, the fact that the Soviets backed off and eliminated all of their land-based SS-20s. These were missiles that had 3 warheads that could strike anywhere in Europe. They were seen as a first strike weapon, in other words, you would use the intermediate range missiles to strike European territory. They were aimed at China, Japan and China as well, by the way. But the point was that they could be used first, and the Soviets would hold off. They'd have their ICBMs in reserve in case the Americans would attack. So this was a situation that the NATO said, okay, we have a double-track decision here. We're going to deploy cruise and Pershing missiles, and we're going to say, okay, we maintain these deployments unless you give up your SS-20s. Well, after negotiations and after two Soviet leaders died and Gorbachev took over, then there was a decision to eliminate all the SS-20s, and the U.S. would not deploy cruise and Pershing missiles. Well, that all seemed very rational, but the point is, as I said, in 1983, we came very close to nuclear war, and there were other incidents as well. But the point is that we're moving back into a very similar period right now if these deployments planned for Germany in 2026 go through. Now, if I could put, there was a slide I wanted to put on here it is. And the next point is when we got up a little bit further, there was another period where the U.S. and Russia, after getting through the INF Treaty and eliminating SS-20s, that's what really ended the Cold War, this reduction in tensions. Soviets were no longer threatening a possible attack against Europe. And it opened the door to peace negotiations that allowed détente to take over, and détente, a general feeling of détente. And that lasted, and here, this is where Ukraine comes in. During that period from 1991 to 1994, the U.S. and Russians worked together. Clinton and Yeltsin had a very close relationship. Clinton played the good cop, promising Ukraine, look, you get rid of these nukes, they're left over in your territory, we know you might want to keep them, but we'll give you finance and assistance, debt relief if you eliminate them. But Yeltsin was saying, oh no, you guys, Ukraine, get rid of those weapons or we're going to preempt them, we're going to attack, and then the Russian nationalists said we're going to take Crimea and other issues. So you went through that period from 1994 to 1991 to 1994, and we came to Budapest, and the big treaty was signed. There was just one catch. Clinton announced the enlargement of NATO just at that time. Boris Yeltsin blew up in rage, saying, how dare he? We have just eliminated the nuclear weapons that Ukraine has maintained or could have maintained after the Cold War, and NATO is already expanding its nuclear, will expand an open-ended enlargement into Russian spheres of influence. And this was really, the December 1994, when Yeltsin blew up, really preceded the speech that Putin made in 2007 that everybody talks about as showing a kind of outrage against NATO enlargement at that time. And now the threats, here's the point, the threats that were made to Crimea and to Ukraine are now, unfortunately, a reality. Now, the critics of NATO enlargement, Paul Nitze, you don't see the signatures there, but Paul Nitze, the founder of American hardline anti-Soviet containment, wrote this letter with Susan Eisenhower, the granddaughter of the president, other top officials that were either retired or experts in Soviet affairs. All of them wrote this very brief a letter that, in my view, is very prophetic to exactly what happened. Now, I won't go into the history of Clinton's decision to enlarge NATO, but the point was he was urging that it is not desirable. Russia does not pose a threat to its Western neighbors. They're not in danger. We believe NATO expansion is neither necessary nor desirable, and it could be put on hold. So Clinton, having won the election, in part because he supported NATO enlargement, he needed the votes of Americans from Eastern European origin, many of which supported NATO enlargement at that time. But his Republican candidate, Robert Doyle, was also supporting NATO enlargement very militantly. So Clinton was kind of caught into having to support NATO enlargement. Anyway, so the point is that if you read this, you'll see that almost everything that's happened, and this is the point right here, is that the START 2 and 3 treaties at that time, now it's New START now, are at risk of collapsing, and now it's New START that's at collapsing. That NATO would draw a new line of division between those who are in and those who are out, and would ultimately diminish the security of those countries not included. We're seeing that, obviously. And the point was NATO enlargement is open-ended, so you didn't know if you were going to be in and out, and the very idea that would come later. Now, Ukraine, bringing Ukraine in was already expressed by the Clinton administration in '94 secretly. It became part of the congressional demand by 1996. So the idea of Ukraine entering NATO really preceded President Bush's decision in 2008 to extend a promise of NATO membership. All right, my point here, this is the key points here, the opening the doors of the European Union to Central and Eastern Europe, partnership for peace. So why did I bring this up here? Is the fact that, in my view, to help resolve the present crisis, we need to reconsider some of these options that were proposed by the critics and try to apply them in new circumstances. Having already expanded NATO, how can we kind of undo the damage somewhat? We're not going to, the U.S. is no way going to give up on the promises that it's already made to NATO members, but how can we secure Europe, but working with Russia, much as the critics had argued? And that's the question I'm posing here for you, and hope we can debate about it. How can we enhance a NATO-Russian relationship? We developed the NATO-Russia Council. We now have a NATO-Ukraine Council. Which is the NATO-Ukraine Council is functioning, the NATO-Russia Council has fallen into disuse at the moment. And can we enhance the partnership for peacekeeping in a way that could deploy peacekeepers in Ukraine if we can find a settlement, a line of control in some time in the near future? And so my point here, and I'll end, and also continuing arms reduction and transparency process, in particular with regard to this should have been what the Clinton administration should have moved towards, but instead focused on NATO enlargement. Now we have to bring back really deep discussions about how to reduce the arms race that we are already involved in, and that will only get worse if the New START treaty it does expire in February 26th. So my point is that if we can find a line, that's between Putin and Zelensky, but nevertheless, the U.S. and China can pressure both Russia, or at least influence Russia and Ukraine, to try to get them to find a line where they can both accept. Now, this, of course, requires Ukraine to, at this time, requires Ukraine to accept a large, almost 20% of its loss of its territory. And here we have a historical analogy to Finland, where Finland, in the case, lost much of Karelia, Potsamo, and other regions, and accepted those terms in order to work with Moscow. And the relationship lasted throughout the Cold War, and now has changed because of NATO enlargement to Finland, which is going to put new pressures on the Northern Europe and the Arctic region from the Russian perspective. So we have several issues here. So my point, I'll end it here, is that if we can find a settlement between Russia and Ukraine, a line of control, we need to deploy international peacekeepers. They can be under a NATO-Russia and NATO-Ukraine Council, so both Russia and Ukraine have a say in what kind of peacekeepers. They wouldn't be the coalition of willing that the Europeans have talked about. They would be international peacekeepers, acceptable by both sides. That's the first point. Ukraine could develop a porcupine defense, but that would still be under international oversight. And We then have to move not beyond Ukraine and start thinking about the north, to Kaliningrad, to the Suwalki corridor, and begin to deconflict that region, and likewise reducing tensions in part related to backing off on deployments of troops and weaponry in the northern areas in order to create a more, at least a period of detente there. Here, I think the next step and last point is neutrality. In the Cold War, you had Austrian neutrality, you had Sweden and Finland neutral, you had Swiss neutrality, of course. Here, I think, crucially, to get a formal settlement, a formal neutrality for Ukraine, that, to me, Ukraine had declared itself neutral when it first declared independence. We need to formalize that neutrality in this, so neither it doesn't join NATO and it doesn't join the Russian CSTO. But at the same time, I think we can look at neutrality for other countries too. We can look at Georgia as a potential neutrality, Moldova, and maybe even Armenia, creating a neutral zone, neutral and non-nuclear zone in this eastern region of Europe. So I really think we just need some foresight, thinking ahead, get the ideas of what we want to achieve, and then hopefully find an opening. Now, the two sides are, Zelensky said he's going to fight for 2 or 3 more years. He wants European support for that. I don't think we have 2 or 3 more years. I think this will if it continues, it will expand into new regions. We've already had a number of incidences that, in my mind, could create a wider war. One of the most dangerous, of course, is the Russian alliance with North Korea made during this war. That is one issue. The next issue is Russia support for China's claims to unify with Taiwan. That's another one. And then you have threats closer to home in Europe, whether it's Moldova or the threats to Estonia and the Balkan states. So, in my view, we have to move very quickly, meaning the U.S. and Europeans, but getting China and other states behind a movement for peace. If we don't do that, I can guarantee by February 2026, if we don't have some movement on the New START treaty, we will be in a much greater disaster than the world has faced in many years. I'll leave it there and see if we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Attila Demkó from the Ludovika University of Public Service. Just a general question to start with. In your view, what are the prospects for peace? Should we be booking out hotel rooms around Budapest?
Peace or ceasefire, that's a big difference. So I think there's a chance for ceasefire quite soon. I'm not saying this year, but soon. So not I think in less than a year. And I think Budapest will play a role for sure. So it's I think it's a question, of course, if it can lead to a lasting ceasefire, because it's a very difficult problem. I think President Trump was right to say that this is the most difficult issue to solve. There is a big reason for that. There is a limited American and European pressure points on Russia. There is quite a lot of pressure points on Ukraine, and I think Ukraine is at the table now, but there are much less opportunities to pressure Russia. So I think the question is when Russia feels that it achieved enough to sit down seriously. So there was a meeting in Alaska that was important, and I think a lot more was discussed than it's in the public domain. Of course, the issue is not only Ukraine, that's another thing between the US and Russia. There are many other issues to solve. The New START treaty, but also there are certain regions, there are issues to solve between the two countries. So I think it can happen. But unfortunately, it's going to happen more on Russia's terms than we would like to have it, because Russia has the momentum. And the issue with war usually is not what we wish, but what is on the battlefield. And what is on the battlefield is very clearly Russian momentum. And I don't think that the question for us to ask is how long Ukraine can sustain the current level of defense in Donbass. And if it can't, I think Russia will ask for even more. So these are the issues. I mean, from a Russian point of view, they invested a lot into this war, and they want at least some results to get out of it.
Mr. Péter Siklósi, I mean, just on that point, a friend of mine who's run some sums has calculated that Russia has effectively operationalized the war. They have something like a 20% debt to GDP gap. That's not going up particularly. And in the horrible phrase, they have sustainable losses at present. I mean, do you think there is enough incentive there for them to actually come to the table here, as Attila has talked about?
If we only look at that part of the calculus, then they might carry on with the war for quite a considerable time. Because, yes, they have operationalized. Of course, it doesn't come without costs for them, but they are doing fairly well. Now, my opinion is that there are other very important parts of their calculus. And basically what they got from the United States is an offer. What they got from Trump is an offer. If you stop the war, we can talk about whether it will be a ceasefire or a peace treaty or whatever. If you stop the war, we will let you back into the Western trade system, Western economic system. If you don't stop the war, we can be very nasty with you. We can help Ukraine for a very long time, I mean from the American side, very cheaply, because we can sell the Europeans weapons. So basically, Europeans will pay for it, and we will benefit from it. So why wouldn't we be able to carry on for a very long time? And we can be even more nasty than we have been so far. We can, of course, the Ukrainians, but with our help, can strike deeper into Russia, can hit more important targets. So with this sticks and carrots on the table, the Russians should decide which path to go down. And for them, my opinion is that getting back into the Western trading system, into the Western economic system, is quite a good offer. Why? Because right now they are in a situation where they are one-sidedly reliant on mostly China. And no power wants to be in a situation to be having to rely on a stronger power. The Russians want to see themselves as a pole. They want to see a multipolar world. They don't want to see a bipolar world where there is China and co, and there is the United States and co. They don't want to be and co. They want to be a separate pole. So for them, the offer to be able to step on two legs again, or 2 feet again, that's quite a good offer. And they can also think that if we agree right now, we will see what happens in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time. Who knows? If we look back after 1994, after the Budapest Memorandum, there were 20 years of peace with Ukraine. We will see how long this lasts, but 20 years is something. We shouldn't try to go for a dream of having a solution forever. In history, there are no solutions forever. There are longer lasting and shorter lasting solutions, but nothing is forever. So I think that's the dilemma the Russians have to choose between. And I agree with Attila that I do think that there is quite a good chance right now to have a deal in a relatively short pace of time.
Yeah, I mean, we talked there about the carrot and the stick and the economic calculus of the war, but then you later picked up on a better point, I think, which is that wars are often about emotion and they're about the sort of momentum of the situation of the self, and Russian prestige is at play here as much as anything. Calum Nicholson, are we maybe missing a bigger picture here?
Thanks, Gavin, and welcome all to Danube Institute. Well, I mean, I was really intrigued by the actual title. I always like when these panels to think about the title we actually got. And the title is Will the War End? Prospects for Peace in Europe. And I don't think they're necessarily related, the first bit of the title and the second part, because we can talk about the war, or we can talk about war in general. And I think there is a big barrier we need to recognize that is, I think, quite endemic, certainly in Anglo culture, which is a sort of pervasive idealism that I think, far from being the wellspring of any solutions to the problems we have, may increasingly be the problem we need to solve. It's worth just pulling back and seeing the broader context in which this war emerged, and indeed perhaps some other conflicts, which is that, well, do you remember, I think one of the things that really told a lot of countries that the circumstance had changed was, I think, the withdrawal of the Americans from Afghanistan in 2021, in October 2021. I don't think it was a good operation in Afghanistan the previous 20 years. But what was really interesting is that I think it bookended a very interesting period in history. When Afghanistan happened, or when the Americans withdrew, and do you remember those images of the terrible image of men falling from planes? I heard people comparing it to 9/11, saying it was like people falling from the towers in 9/11. I actually thought of a very different analogy. I thought the falling men were the bookend to the falling little boy bomb over Japan, simply because that bomb started the era of American supremacy, of absolute, unipolar power, essentially. And when those men fell from those planes, it was a very embodied manifestation of the collapse of that entire project, that idea that the Americans perhaps had not just might on their side, but maybe right as well, that the idea that they even were principled in what they were doing, because the withdrawal was so sudden, but also sort of falsified the idea of American power. And I think in the wake of that image, of the wake of that withdrawal, you suddenly started to see old tensions throughout the world reopen like poorly sutured wounds. If you look at a lot of the tensions that exist in the world today, and I think the one in Ukraine and Russia is one of them, these are tensions which are often tensions that you can see the same pattern happening pre-World War II, indeed leading to World War II. And then we all took a break for 80 years, and now these things are reopening. And so my point is, I think that we need to recognize that we're entering an era where there are going to be a lot of conflicts like this. This is not, the Ukraine war shouldn't be viewed in isolation. There will be other things happening like this. And I think what we need to let go of if we're going to deal with the reality is precisely the sort of idealism where we begin from how the world ought to be rather than beginning from what simply is the case. And because if you face reality, idealism is quite uncompromising. It's quite hard to find solutions if you're too idealistic. The future is going to be one built around compromise. There's a certain, the humility of compromise, not the hubris of thinking the world ought to be written in our image. And so I just think in all of this, we need to make sure that we are looking at these sorts of issues without the framing of some sort of abstract idealism, which I think a lot of this image, certainly through the Anglosphere anyway, has been viewed in those terms. So my broader point simply is here, I don't think it's just, will the war end? Maybe this war may end. I think Attila referenced that peace is not necessarily the same thing as an armistice, or a ceasefire is not something as peace. If you look at Ukraine, it's quite likely there will not be a peace, as we understand peace to be, with some treaty. There may be a ceasefire, there may be an armistice. And actually, there's a lot of precedence for that. You know, North Korea since 1953, they've never had a peace treaty. They have an armistice of sorts. India and Pakistan with a line of control in Jammu and Kashmir. You know, the Kuril Islands, Russia and Japan. Cyprus. You know, there are many cases where there is no peace, but there is maybe a ceasefire. And then it comes to the point, at what point do you want the killing to stop? And I think certainly, you know, one of the costs, of course the war is an existential threat. It seems the Ukrainians are very worried about it. But one of the costs, you know, living in Hungary, I'm not Hungarian, but one thing the Hungarians think are very worried about is what happens to the minorities in Ukraine. Not because the minorities are necessarily being persecuted directly in the context of the war, but given the option to leave, they will leave if the country is not stable. And so then those communities will be lost forever. So there is this kind of need to urgently deal with reality as it is, and that's going to require an entirely different frame of reference than has dominated since probably World War II, in the Anglosphere at least, and certainly since the end of the Cold War.
Gardner, what do you make of that new frame of reference? I mean, are we, I guess the first premise would be moving into a multipolar world, and should, or even could, Russia be one of those poles?
Right. I'm allergic to the term multipolarity. I think it's becoming a propaganda term. I prefer polycentrism because none of the powers, multipolarity implies equality of power and it implies hard power, and none of the powers today are equal in terms of power capabilities or political, economic, and social, cultural influence. So I prefer uneven polycentrism because Russia is maybe a tremendous military power, but it's not an economic, it's a resource power, but not an industrial power. China's becoming industrial. If there's two poles, it might be U.S. and China, but I prefer the term bicentric system, maybe tricentric with Russia. Anyway, that's an academic debate. I want to get back to the practical. We have to think practically, and we have to offer, but at the same time we have to offer things that are practical, that can be accomplished, and not idealistic things. So here, I talked about deconflicting Kaliningrad, for example. If you look at Kaliningrad's position in Europe, and in part in its historical position, Kaliningrad is the perfect place to create a trade hub between the Polar Silk Road, between Northern Europe, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Convince the Russians that this would be in their benefit to develop Kaliningrad as an active economic point, focal point for business and enterprise and global trade. And believe me, we can begin to deconflict and turn Kaliningrad away from being a military enclave, which it's become, to something that's beneficial for both Russia and Europe in general. The point is you have to present these kind of visions, and of course there's all the details that go with them and how you go about that. But it seems to me if we come up with practical visions that can serve all sides, then we might begin to say, okay, this conflict is really in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia really serving no one, not even yourselves. You're killing people for nothing. Let's look at the bigger picture and see how we can do that. And I agree with Peter's point of view that China will eat Russia from the inside out if this war continues. So it's in the Russian interest to begin to look towards the West, at least for as I said, if we can really create a viable economic path. We're not going to just give them money, but something like a trade as I said, creating a trading center for Kaliningrad would transform the economy of the entire region. And the same thing for the Black Sea. There's such tremendous resources in the Black Sea. If the two sides weren't polarizing against each other and began to develop those resources, so opening up some options that because you're caught in the struggle, you're not thinking about what options, what scenarios could be considered if we begin to think out of the box. So.
Mr. Attila Demkó, so I guess Hull was talking there about means for peace that could be writ by other ways, for instance, building up Kaliningrad. In your opinion, I mean, at the start of the year, Mr. Trump was talking about potentially mining interests, US mining interests in the middle of Ukraine. Do you think we should be looking for proactive and cooperative ways to kind of knit together trade? Is trade actually at the core of this?
You mean trade with Russia?
Yeah.
Well, I think first we need at least to rebuild a minimal level of trust. Who will invest in Russia? I mean, if we threaten Russia with taking away their $200 million, and Russia is threatening us, and they are also, threatening us with taking away your property in Russia. So we are very far away from that moment now. First, we should think really thoroughly about if it's a good idea to take away the Russian assets which are in Belgium and other Western states, because then we open another chapter and we escalate the war to a very large degree. So we are not there to build anything. We are right now, at least in Europe, we are going to the other direction. We are going to the direction how to punish Russia. And of course, when we are thinking about punishing Russia, I talk about the European Commission and some states, especially in our region. They are not really thinking how we will be punished on the other side with our property taken by the Russians. So it's like sometimes I feel that Europeans still did not get where they are in this game, and they are not at a level that they can dictate to Russia without serious self-harm. So I think first we have to realize, at least in Europe where we are, in real power. But also I think the Americans sometimes overestimate their influence on Russia. And that's why I think Mr. Trump is a bit unhappy about the results. I think he was really believing that he can make a deal much faster. But he didn't, maybe not the 24 hours, but he believed that it can be fast. But why it's not fast? Because the Russians hate us. There is an absolute pure hatred now in Russia for Europe and the West. And when we talk about that China will eat Russia inside out, I don't think they care now. They hate us so much. And not only because of the last 3 years, they see that I'm not saying they are right. I'm not saying they are right. I'm saying what they feel. They feel that they were misled, they were mistreated. We had agreements, the Russians say all the time, you broke those agreements, you went around invading countries. That's what they say. And when we defend our people, of course this is a Russian propaganda thing, but some of them do believe their own propaganda. In Ukraine, then you have this. So and definitely there are Western double standards. In Hungary, we feel how some Western countries live in their own bubble and having very serious double standards about issues. So that's why I think there is more on this. I have no love lost on the current Russian government, but I do understand why they feel that there are double standards. So first, we have to solve these issues. These very deep emotional issues between the two sides, and we cannot solve it even with taking even more extreme steps, because the Russians will respond the same way, and we can go around until we are at near war situation with Russia, and Russia will not be stopped with threats. We can only do engagement, because they are for them. And I think Obama was right in that, President Obama. They have the escalation dominance, and they are pretty much ready to go into the wall, as we say in Hungary, to elmenni a falig, to go to the extremes. And I don't think the people in Brussels, they do get the situation with President Putin and those people who are much more nationalistic than him. So it's not only President Putin, that's the biggest mistake. He cannot give up Donbass. It's not an issue. The same way Zelensky cannot give up. That's why I think the war will continue until Donbass falls. So that's the issue. And then we understand that it's a game we all lose when Europeans understand we lose a lot, then maybe we can make some more pragmatic steps than what we are making now, which is in my way, it's not a strategy what Europe has towards Russia. It's a dream, or it's a wishful thinking, series of wishes which are not going to happen.
So we talked there about the slight intransigence of Europe, and there's some perhaps occasionally delusional quality to the way they view it, and the intense Russian hatred that comes from the other side. So let's just get to the meat now and talk about what a potential treaty would look like. Because let's say if we were in Budapest in 2 weeks' time and the big guns go just a few meters up to the castle district, sit down to do their work, what are the things that are on the table? What are the easy wins? What are the sticking points? What is Europe prepared to give up? Péter Siklósi.
I don't think that's a very difficult question. It's pretty clear that the most probably the ceasefire line will be the contact line at the moment, roughly. Maybe there might be some small land swaps, but not much. Ukraine will not become a NATO member. We can argue about how that will be formulated, whether the Ukrainians will make a neutrality pledge or whatever. But it's pretty clear that they will not become a NATO member. And then the big question is guarantees. How to guarantee that such a ceasefire should be lasting. And here again, since there is no real strong willingness from Western Europe or from the United States to send strong, substantial troops to Ukraine to guarantee the ceasefire. I'm not talking about a mostly symbolic observation force or something like that. A substantial troop contribution would amount to several tens of thousands of troops, and there are no willingness to do that. So the biggest guarantee for Ukraine can be what called the porcupine Ukraine. So basically Ukraine's own defense capabilities. Now, the question is, how will we get there? And here I must say that even I use the word we, but there is no we here. There is the United States and there are the Europeans. And there is no we, because there are huge differences between the two. First of all, the Americans are strong and the Europeans are weak. That's the biggest difference. Then another difference is that the Americans are pragmatic and realists, and the Europeans are ideology-driven. So they are unable to compromise here, and I totally agree with you. If you are this kind of ideology-driven, then the world for you is black or white, good or evil. And there can be no compromise between good and evil. You have to defeat evil. And of course, we are the good all the time, and the other side is the evil, naturally. So there cannot be compromise, and only a realist can make compromises. And the third huge difference is that the Americans have a vision, a strategic vision of the future, how the future would look like. And the Europeans don't. That's not a vision that we will help Ukraine as long as it takes. Okay, but what do you want to achieve? And there is no answer for that. The only answer we sometimes get is that Ukraine has to defeat Russia. Yeah, okay, but that's unrealistic. So these are the bad news. The good news is that in this sense, Europe does not count. It will be the Americans and the Russians who will agree. Of course, the substance of such an agreement has to be acceptable for Ukraine. It will be hard for them to accept, I agree, but at the end they will accept it. They will not like it, they will not smile, but at the end they will, with a little help from the Americans, they will accept it. And then the Europeans will not have any other choice but to go along. You know, if the deal is done, then what can Europe do? Will they try to keep the war going on their own and almost bankrupt Europe? Come on, that's impossible. So they will also have to go along.
Calum Nicholson, I mean, what does a realistic vision look like for Europe? I mean, are they, capable of flipping the narrative into the 21st century?
That's interesting. So it's a very interesting question. To what extent is Europe, or rather, I suppose, the EU, and sort of the powers that be in the elites of Europe, to what extent are they now so deeply wedded to a particular ideological stance, or rather, when I say ideological stance, I don't even really necessarily mean a particular ideology, but rather wedded to an ideal as opposed to simply what is real. And it doesn't matter what the ideal is, but to say that we view the world from the starting point of how we believe it ought to be, which I think is you've drawn a distinction between the Americans who are beginning from the world as it is. And I think certainly, being in Hungary, I think when you look at what's happening politically in Hungary, I think sometimes in terms of geopolitics, the reason that they're not really understood, I think, in Brussels, for instance, is the Hungarians have simply a different frame of reference. It begins from a more realist starting point. So the real question is, to what extent is Europe wedded to that type of idealism? Because if you're really wedded to something, you don't even realize that you are. You know, a fish doesn't know what water is. You know, does the EU know what water is? Does it know what idealism is? Or are they simply fighting the good fight in a neutral, apolitical, technocratic sense without realizing that technocratic mindset that is blind to tradition, to history, and so on, that sees land but not culture or territory, is a big issue. And actually, to some extent, though, there's another cultural difference, I think, and we were talking about this, I think, a bit earlier. You were talking about how it's very difficult to understand Russia without having read, for instance, Russian literature, among other things. And and I think there's some truth in that. And I saw a quote a while back, and I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was that the challenge between the Americans and the Russians, and Trump in particular, is Trump sees land and sees real estate, but the Russians view land and see territory or culture or history or tradition. And it's a slightly different framing. And so we can all be looking at the same problems through different lenses. So this question of Europe, can it shift to a more realist stance? Well, first they have to recognize that they perhaps are not, that they have an idealist stance. And it is very difficult to get someone to recognize the assumptions that are built into their frame of reference. Few of us want to reflect on that, because that's quite existential, to then start thinking, oh, these are the assumptions I'm making, and perhaps these assumptions are not axiomatically true. Perhaps they are, maybe not even a choice, but they are something that could be otherwise. Because as soon as you recognize it, you realize it may be part of the problem you have, not part of the solution.
Gardner, you mentioned the porcupine defense, the porcupine doctrine, you might say, in your opening remarks, which is the first time I'd heard that phrase used since the summer when Ursula von der Leyen came out and used that Ukraine must make itself a steel porcupine after the London conference. I mean, do you think that the porcupine doctrine has weight then?
Well, I mean, I thought it was a big mistake for Ukraine to go into the Kursk region in Russia. It didn't do what Zelensky said it was going to do, which is allow a territory to be traded off at some time in the future, and they put some of their best people there. And what happened? The North Koreans came in, which no one really expected. And now we have this Russian-North Korean alliance. And believe me, that's a very dangerous phenomenon because it impacts South Korea and Japan as well as U.S. strategy in the Pacific. So that's the point. But by porcupine defense, I mean one that's supervised by a NATO-Russia council or a NATO-Ukraine council that would oversee what kind of defenses Ukraine would be allowed. But I want to get back to the European question because there is something driving the Europeans, and particularly the French. I live in France, so I absorbed this idealism of President Macron. On the one hand, you have this perceived existential threat coming from Russia with its nuclear threats just recently, and of course physical threats of moving closer and closer to Europe and threatening not or taking over territory in Ukraine, but also threatening the Baltic states. But even more profound, I think, for the Europeans is the idea that the United States might not come to defend them as they had promised throughout the entire Cold War. And that, in my mind, is really what's driving the Europeans, with Macron promising to extend the French nuclear umbrella over all of Eastern Europe, with Germany engaging in an unforeseen military buildup that, from the Russian perspective, must be frightening, and Poland as well. So we have, and the UK and France coming together in coordinating their nuclear deterrent, theoretically without the United States backing. So we have a new Europe developing here in its embryo. It's going to be a totally different Europe than what we saw during the Cold War, where it wasn't the Europeans, it was the Americans keeping the Europeans down. The Europeans wanted to increase their defense coordination throughout the Cold War, but Madeleine Albright said, no, you can't duplicate NATO weapons, you can't discriminate against NATO members, et cetera. And so the Europeans are they're forced existentially to develop a new approach to their security. And I think this is going to drive and affect all the different members of NATO, and Europe, impact all of Europe. But here's the catch. This is where I said in the earlier talk, if this war continues, that will drive the defense structures in the European Union. It will create a lot of tensions inside the whole fabric of society in Europe. And it will be very, very destabilizing. And that's another reason why this war has to come to an end very soon, because it will not only destabilize the Russia-Ukraine situation, but Europe caught in the middle of this will have, I think, major social and political problems.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'd just like to think a bit about what happens once the earthquake is over. So the war ends. What happens when an earthquake finishes is the new valleys and rivers are created. I mean, you talked a bit there, and a bit in your intro, in fact, about the Russia-North Korea axis and China and Russia and the Taiwan question. These are geopolitical tectonic plates that will move in the advent of a peace treaty. So I'd just like to open it to the panel, and maybe we can go around, or just people can jump in, to talk about an unintended consequence or something that we feel will happen in the next 5 to 10 years, in part as consequence of this, that we perhaps weren't looking for.
Sure. Well, there's a really interesting quote that I can't remember exactly, but it was from Edward R. Murrow in 1941, writing from London to his American audience. And he said, you must understand that the world is changing, the old orthodoxies and frames of reference and so on, they're all going, and new ones will come in their place. And I do think, coming back to my opening comments, was this idea that, you know, the Romans had this idea of a saclium, that the 80 years, the course of human memory, and at the end, and every 80 years, memory is lost of what happened 80 years before, and then culture shifts. And if you look around us right now in the culture in general, a lot of things are changing. There's a sense of we're in a period of liminality, where a lot of the old orthodoxies are giving up the ghost, and there's a lot of reversal of norms and so on. And so I think there is a broader pattern. I mean, I've said before, it wasn't, there was a question of the war, but also wars. But there's also a broader question of change in general. And I think everything we're viewing here is in the context of these destabilizing changes that are coming, the end of this 80-year cycle. Call it kind of the boomer cycle in the Anglosphere, the people who born in the... I mean, it's worth noting, by the way, and we kind of talk about how strange this is. Ever since someone from the first cohort baby boomer group, born in 1946, could become president, they've basically remained president ever since. Bill Clinton from 93 was born in August 46, replaced by Bush born in July 46. Hillary Clinton, if she'd beaten Obama, would have been 47. And Trump was born in June 46, a month before, and Biden was the only exception. He's 42, and now we've got Trump until 20... So that means from 1993 to 2029, with the exception of Obama, which is a weird case, we've had a president born in the summer of 1946 or earlier in the United States. We've been locked into one generation's culture for that long. And so it's about time that everything begins to change. It is changing. And so I think there is this question of, we're at a similar stage to what happened in the 1940s, that in 10 years, the frame of reference for all of us will be so profoundly different, not just the facts we know, but the entire frame of reference is going to be so profoundly different that we have no capability now, I think, to predict what that will be then. But it is going to change. It absolutely cannot be otherwise at this stage.
Mr. Attila Demkó?
So what Calum said is very important, I think. If you don't change the Western mindset, then there will be more and more earthquakes, like this war in Ukraine. If we don't learn to be humble, to understand where is our place now in the world, we are not the middle of the world anymore. And if we still talk to the other parts of the world like we used to talk, or we are still talking, we will end up like Kaja Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen ended up in China in a little bus taken from the airport. When I was in China a few weeks ago, I was waited by a car and the driver. And Kaja Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen was put into a bus. So either we learn to be humble or we will be humbled. And this is what Russia in a way doing. That, guys, we told Russia that you can be a secondary, tertiary member of our club, behave, and you can be a member of our club. And Russia said, no, we don't want to be a member of your club with these if we are secondary or tertiary. So this is the issue, and this war will not end. I mean, I think peace and ceasefire is a very different thing. So it's not going to end, and there are many other conflicts which can open up. And I think if we really don't change our mindset, they will open up.
Can I just ask me, because I like this analogy of the earthquake. I mean, there's a famous line in scholarship around disaster risk reduction where they say earthquakes don't kill people. They say what kills people is collapsing buildings. And the point of this is that disasters aren't natural, hazards are natural, but disasters are social, they're political, they're economic, they're historical. It's how we construct our societies. If you build in the wrong way if you build a city on an earthquake fault line, it's probably going to be knocked down a few times. And earthquakes are natural in a sense. I don't want to draw out the analogy too much, but the point is that things readjusting are going to happen inevitably. The question is if we have a brittle, rigid culture, meaning a culture that's founded on a mania around how we think the world ought to be, instead of dealing with the world as it is, again, then we will inevitably have our buildings collapsing, institutionally, politically, morally, whatever it is. The house of cards will collapse, in a sense. So I think it's a case if we're making adjustments. We just need to be starting from a different basis, founded in humility, as he said, realism. These are and a case of what is, rather than what ought to be. And if we reframe how we think on those terms, then perhaps we will be in a better situation to weather whatever future quakes, or weather is the wrong analogy, but to survive whatever future tremors that come.
Yes.
After this little bit philosophical detour, let me turn back to how I think the world, and most specifically Europe, will look like after the war ends. Although Europe at the moment has no idea what kind of relationship they want with Russia after the war. But since Russia will stay there and we will also stay here, we will have to find some kind of a coexistence with them. And after the United States will start to trade with Russia again, we won't have any other choice but to do the same. By the way, most probably it will look like whatever the European leaders will want to do when the EU will get to the next biannual revision of the sanctions, which has to be agreed in every 6 months. Someone, most probably Viktor Orban, will put up his hand and say, you know, there is an agreement. The Americans made a deal. Some of you were there behind the leaders, smiled. So why would we go on with sanctions? I don't agree. There will be no sanctions anymore. That's my guess how it will happen in Europe. And so Europeans will have to learn to coexist and trade basically with the Russians. Now, that new relationship will definitely not build on love. And it will not build on trust either, because trust is lost for a long time. It will be built on economic interests on one hand, and trade on one hand, and deterrence on the other. So there will be simultaneously strong militaries deterring each other and economic cooperation, at least trade with each other according to the mutual interests lines in the future. So that's how I can imagine what will happen. Of course, a lot of European leaders who were basically sticked to their idea of never talking to the Russians again, they will have a hard time this time talking to their own voters. Why did they do that, and how did they get into that situation? But that's their problem. The Americans or the U.S. was in the same situation under Biden, but for the U.S. it took one elections to change course. The problem in Europe is that for Europeans it takes several elections. One election is not enough. Now, the good news, and that's my last point here, is that the current military technological era favors the defender. And it's very hard for offense to be successful. Like in the First World War. There are no huge operational movements on the battlefield. What the military call C4ISR, so the reconnaissance is very precise, the decision-making cycle is very quick, and the destruction on the other hand is very precise again, which means that it's very hard for an offending power to gain huge territories, like we can see in Ukraine. So if we do believe that the West or NATO does not want to attack Russia, and it's Russia which we suspect wants to attack us, then the good news is that they would be, for them it would be a very hard task to succeed. And we can be pretty sure after almost 4 years of war in Ukraine that the Russians also know this very well. So they will be counter-incentivized to attack us. So my opinion is that such a peace can last quite a considerable amount of time. Of course, nothing is forever, and this military technological era will be over someday because of new technological developments, but it will last for at least a couple of years.
Hall, do you want to chip in? Is there something that's 5 or 10 years away that you think we're all missing?
Real quick, I want
Yeah.
to pick up on Attila's point. Wanted to pick up on Attila's point that, and try to draw it into the conversation with Europe. First of all, the American triumphalist attitude towards Russia at the end of the Cold War was one of the fundamental reasons for the beginnings of the Russian backlash. They felt like they were being put down, that they didn't, the U.S. didn't recognize their own struggle against the Soviet system. The Americans made it sound like they did it all, the Cold War, we won the Cold War. Second point, even drawing the Russians closer to NATO, you had Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin saying they would join NATO, but only if they were treated as equals, and that was Putin's point there. He was willing to work. They worked in the NATO-Russia Council. Putin provided logistics for that fiasco in Afghanistan. That Americans is another issue. That's another problem. But the point is, the Russians helped after the war, the global war on terrorism in Afghanistan, providing logistics for NATO, and yet they weren't rewarded. NATO went ahead and expanded to the Baltic states and continued promising. So there was a put down, and the European Union. There was no coordination between the United States and the European Union. I call it the uncoordinated double enlargement. Both went in and just assumed that they could just take and move into Russian defined spheres of influence and security. And so when the EU made its Eastern Partnership for Ukraine, there was no consideration of what that meant for the Russian investments and concerns in Ukraine at the time. So I don't blame NATO entirely for this crisis that we're in. So the last point is, in reconsidering U.S., NATO, EU relations with Russia, we need to think about how to draw Russia, where to respect Russia and its interest, but at the same time, as I said, boost up Ukraine as best we can to prevent any further conflict between the two sides.